If you want to understand limits, you need to understand the kind of problem that limits are meant to solve. Here's an example. In ancient Greece, there was a philosopher named Zeno the Stoic. We know about him because he had some very interesting views. One of those views was that the idea of motion is nonsensical. You see, if I have this cup here, I can move it from here to here. And, well, it's changed its position. Zeno would agree with that. He'd say, sure it did. But he would also say that it didn't do so by moving. How would he try to explain it? Well, he might give us an example like a movie. You know, you go to see a movie and on the screen you see some, James Bond is doing some crazy action. Well, actually, there's no motion anywhere in that film. If you look at the individual frames, you'll see that in each of those frames, James Bond is completely still. What you're seeing on the screen is a succession of still images, and the illusion of motion is created by your brain stitching those images together. Zeno would say that that's what motion is. It's an illusion in your brain to enable you to try to understand how the cup gets from one place to another, but it does not move. Now, Zeno came up with a number of parables or paradoxes, and that's how we know about him today, because these little stories or mind games were things he used to help illustrate how nonsensical the concept of motion is. I'd like to tell you about one called the parable of Achilles and the tortoise. It goes like this. I, Zeno, attended the Olympic Games, and I was there on the final day of the Games when the great runner Achilles won the 100-yard dash and was crowned the champion of the Games. We all cheered, we all celebrated, there was a great party to end the Games, and then the festival ended and we all headed back to our villages and towns. My town, Alea, was at the end of a long road, and so I set out. And as I was setting out, who should come up to me but the great runner Achilles? And he said to me, Zeno, your town and my town lie on the same road. Why don't we walk together to keep each other company and pass the time? I thought this was a great idea, and so Achilles and I set off. And we were discussing things. He's not all muscles, he's a smart guy. So we had some great discussions. Now, as we were going along, we came upon a tortoise at the side of the road, and the tortoise challenged Achilles to a foot race. So we have a tortoise and we have Achilles, the world's fastest man. This is not going to end well for the tortoise. In fact, Achilles is so confident, he says to the tortoise, look, I will give you a 50-yard head start. I'll let you start halfway to the finish line and I'll still beat you. So the contestants agree, and then they ask me, Zeno, to judge the race because I'm known for my wisdom and impartial judgment. I go to the finish line and I tell the contestants to take their marks, and I raise my hand and I begin the race. And Achilles blows away the tortoise. It's not even close. I mean, he's the world's fastest man, so, The contestants shake hands and we go on our way. Something that happened during the race, and I want to tell you about this because it puzzles me. You see, if you'll recall, Achilles started the race 50 yards behind the tortoise. And so when the race began, Achilles had to run all the way to where the tortoise was. Now, when he reached the point the tortoise was at, the tortoise had moved forward a certain distance. So once again, Achilles found himself behind the tortoise, and he ran to the point the tortoise was at, only to find that once again the tortoise had moved forward a small distance. Once again, Achilles runs forward to reach the point the tortoise was starting from, only to see the tortoise has moved ahead. Now I ask you, how many times will Achilles reach the point the tortoise is starting from, only to find that the tortoise has moved ahead? Well, the answer is an infinite number of times, right? Because no matter what time you pick, if you say after 50 times, I will tell you that on the 50th time, he started behind the tortoise, he moved to where the tortoise was, and the tortoise moved ahead. Now, each of those steps might be a very small step, but they are finite in size. And so Achilles has to cover an infinite number of finite steps in order to reach the point the tortoise is at. And yet he never does. And so I ask you, how is it possible that that Achilles could even catch the tortoise, let alone pass him? Now, I'm not telling you Achilles didn't win the race. I was there and I saw him. What I'm telling you is if you think he did it by movement, by motion, you're insane, because motion doesn't make sense. He can't even catch the tortoise, let alone pass him. And that's the story of Achilles and the tortoise. Now, if you think about that, it does make quite a bit of sense. And yet, of course, something tells us, well, no, of course he has to catch the tortoise and pass him. So how can we reconcile these two things together? Well, limits form an important part of that. And so I'll explain that to you, but I think first of all, I'll need to teach you a little bit about limits, and you can check that out in my first video on limits.